evening. It's great to be with you, and I'm thrilled to talk today about how your leadership might compare with Steve Jobs. I actually got the idea for this whole line of learning from leadership from the founder of Infosys, Madinah, with whom I've been working for the last nearly 5 years and just recently moved back to the U.S. So he himself is a remarkable leader, has worked with Steve Jobs, and although he didn't give me the idea for Steve Jobs, he recognizes the value of studying both the beauty and the blemishes of great leaders, and he is very self-effacing himself in spite of achieving great things. So today, I want to spend time sharing with you what the science tells us about Steve Jobs' leadership that we can learn from. And you're going to leave today with 5 areas that you can take away and reflect on and incorporate into your own career, both things Steve Jobs did extremely well as mistakes he made that even he admitted he wished he had not. I'm going to close before questions with some new technologies that can leverage Steve's own technology to help you grow faster in ways that Steve Jobs himself wasn't even able to leverage. So let me start out with, why should we study famous leaders? Well, besides being interesting, these are amazing people who did amazing things and changed the world, or in Steve Jobs' terms, put a dent in the universe. We all would be better. The world would be a better place if we were to mimic some of the wonderful things people like Gandhi or Martin Luther King or Steve Jobs were able to do. But a second reason is that sometimes we idolize these people too much. They were human. They all make mistakes, just like we all do, and have regrets. And so if we can humanize them and realize that they were able to achieve great things at eminent levels of leadership in spite of having serious flaws, we ourselves may be more able to cope and overcome our own limitations, our own weaknesses as leaders. Lastly, we want to study famous leaders because there's good science from Alfred Bandura from Stanford University called social cognitive theory. It tells us that we're unique as a species in that we can learn without having gone through experience ourselves. We're going to see in a moment that Steve Jobs' experiences shaped him and grew him to be a better and better leader over time. And we don't have to go through exactly his experiences, especially his failures, to ourselves learn from him. So these are some of the reasons we want to study famous leaders, including but not limited to Steve Jobs. Steve had a remarkable career from very modest beginnings. He and Steve Wozniak were buddies in Silicon Valley before it was really a hotbed of technology. In the late 60s, early 70s, he and Steve were both fond of technology, actually starting out with illegal technology, selling technology to steal telephone calls called phreaking. And it was really Steve Wozniak, Jobs' friend, who came up with the first Apple. And Steve's contribution early on was really about convincing Intel and Hewlett-Packard to give them free parts or massively reduced parts and then sell the resultant technology at much higher prices. He made some mistakes because they started out in an illegal way. They actually stopped selling the phreaking illegal technology when someone pulled a gun on them when they didn't want to pay Jobs and Wozniak. And so that was an early example where he did something that wasn't so merit-worthy and learned from it and changed his ways. From there, he was able to pioneer, really more than anyone else, other than maybe Bill Gates, the entire personal computer industry. He was able to produce the first commercially viable mouse, the world's first graphical user interface. He later, of course, famously was more or less fired from his own company, by the CEO he recruited from Pepsi, John Scully, and even after that was able to bounce back and start an entire new industry through his company Pixar with the world's first completely computer-generated movie, Toy Story. Equally famously, he came back. He initially was an advisor at Apple when Gil Amelio was running into troubles, and eventually took over as CEO with an amazing recovery to a level that Apple was the largest company in the world around the time of his death. So he had an amazing set of turns in his career, and the good news is we have more than 50 years of science that tell us a great deal about leadership across every culture, every industry. There are cross-cultural differences that might be a little different in your part of the world, but learning from Steve and his mistakes and successes can be useful if we put on a pair of glasses that science give us that tell us what great leadership is. And the metaphor I'm going to use to summarize all of this science is a cake. Steve was famously transformational, charismatic, committed, extremely passionate, able to really think and inspire the team beyond the classics. He was equally famous for his design sensibilities. His early student activity, actually after dropping out of college at Reed College, was to incorporate many aspects of aesthetics, including calligraphy, into the fonts that we all use today. He was also a great team worker. He was a great follower, initially of Wozniak's technology and later Johnny Ive's design sensibilities. He was very committed to following others that were substantially better than him in some areas. And this is a surprising area to some people, that great leaders like Steve Jobs want to follow when someone else has better ideas, because they're really committed to the vision and the future of their organization. Lastly, we're going to talk in more detail about Steve's transactional leadership. This is how Steve sometimes gave amazing rewards to people, but also had some serious foibles in terms of his interpersonal difficulties. Let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. In the area of transformational leadership, the science tells us there's three pieces to charismatic transformational leadership. This is really around the emotional, exciting frosting of leadership at the top of the cake. Steve was famous for intellectually stimulating everyone around him. They called this the reality distortion field. He would use brilliant metaphors like insanely great or making a dent in the universe to help every single member of the team feel strongly committed to the cause. His charisma, we know today, is in part his deep passion and personal sacrifices to really make his vision for the computer industry really change the world. He's famous for recruiting John Scully from Pepsi by saying, do you want to sell sugar water for the rest of your life, or do you want to change the world? These are the elements that he was brilliant at transformationally. And you can see another area is around individualized consideration. And I have that in red on this screen because this is an area where he struggled. He did a few things well, like he would reward people in sometimes personalized ways, but he also infamously was abusive to people. He would swear at them and embarrass them and belittle them publicly at times, so much so that many of his support systems had to constantly coach and mentor him about how destructive his leadership could be. And so this is an area we would want to avoid. He was embarrassed in his biography by Walter Isaacson that he abandoned his first child that he had out of wedlock. He ignored her. He didn't even want to admit it was his own daughter. And so in the area of really individualized consideration, Steve Jobs is not a world-class leader at all, or someone we would want to emulate. Rather, we would want to avoid the mistakes he himself regretted at the end of his life. But in all, you can see that we would all agree that Steve Jobs transformed the personal computer industry and made Apple into what it is today, in spite of the fact that he had some of this interpersonal failings. Second is Steve Jobs' brilliant instrumental leadership. Perhaps more than anyone, he was able to scan the environment and see what was out there and how he could use that and the future trends of technology to really make something insanely great. He was famous for convincing Xerox to open up their Palo Alto facility, where he saw the first glimpses of a graphical user interface and the first application of a mouse, which he took far beyond what Xerox or any of their leaders were able to do themselves. They failed to commercialize what Steve Jobs could see in the environment. So his ability to envision a very, very clean, usable, exciting, game-changing way to use technology to show people, regular people, what technology could do, make it very, very clean and easy, was second to none. We can all learn from Steve in this particular area. His approach to building a strategy, he had many interesting experiments in Northern California around ways he could scale up his volumes, creative ways of persuading people to join the company, including flying to their country, notably the design experts in Germany. In his second round at Apple, he convinced to open up a new location. His ability to set extremely difficult but achievable goals and convincing people that they could actually achieve these difficult goals. In spite of his personal, interpersonal rough edges, many people who worked with him said that they really were inspired by really making a difference in the world by achieving his very earth-shattering, first-in-the-world goals. And he could be very supportive of high-performing followers, people he thought were brilliant. He could be equally destructive on people he didn't think were brilliant, but he was very supportive and would get the resources required to help bring his vision to the reality. Teamwork. He started out Apple with Steve Wozniak. He and Woz were friends. They were both pranksters. He would defer to Wozniak. He couldn't do the technical things Wozniak could do in the very beginning. In fact, that's one of the reasons he started the Apple Lisa. He wanted to get out of the shadow of Wozniak's technical expertise and show that he too could lead a technical team. So he proactively supported Woz, who was not so sure about pricing the early Apples. He didn't know how to get the materials or how to convince people to give him a discount. Jobs was very courageous and followed Wozniak in the technical details early on, and then adapted, and they had a shared mental model about how Apple was to evolve and having a real fun time and growing their company together. And of course, this changed over time. Eventually, Wozniak never wanted a leadership role. Steve had other people he chose to follow, including Johnny Ives, who he called his spiritual partner. And he would often follow Ives' design sensibility, who he thought was superior to his own. And he found this very stimulating, that he and Ives shared mental models about how to design things that were insanely great. So Steve Jobs is often not thought of this way, but he was truly great at teamwork. Lastly, transactional leadership is sort of the base of the cake. He would notoriously give out Rolexes in the early days. He'd keep 10 of them in his office, and he'd wear them and take it off his wrist when he saw someone doing something really great and rewarding them for that greatness. He also gave a Porsche to one gentleman who beat Apple's sales records in the middle of his career. The area that's red, though, where he struggled, was he made people feel stung when they screwed up. So management by exception, he would often micromanage and get into all kinds of levels of detail and abuse and berate people when they didn't do things that, in a way that he found to be especially stellar and useful. So in this area, we don't want to be like Steve Jobs, where he really damaged some relationships. And he could have been a much better leader and inspire people if he was not so micromanaging and berating of people who didn't quite meet up to his mark. So that's the evidence-based kind of cake way to think of his leadership in detail. Let's step back for a minute and look at sort of a 50,000-foot view of his entire career in three major pieces. The beginning of his career, he was really irreverent. He was brash. He worked at Atari, but he didn't often wear shoes. He was on a fruitarian diet. He didn't think he needed to bathe, and his coworkers would often complain about him not smelling good. So he would often do things that weren't so conscientious, including with Wozniak. He brought Wozniak into Apple to help him create a game, and didn't tell the truth to Woz about the reward that was possible if they got the game done in 4 days, which Woz did, even though he worked nights to really get that thing done. So in the startup era of Steve, he was fun. They were doing pranks. They thought it was fun to steal phone calls and make crank calls to the Vatican, for example. Irreverent. But it wasn't a way to really have a mature, credible organization. And so much of his early development and as much of his early mentoring was around getting an adult to help him manage his organization in a way that was really more effective than a teenager kind of approach. As he moved into the middle of his career, he really was changing the world. He was producing these world firsts and was growing like crazy. He was a multi-millionaire by the time he was 27. And so he really did change the world. But he recruited, knowing full well that he wasn't quite ready to be leading a large multinational. He recruited John Sculley, and the venture capitalists like Arthur Rock were notoriously more short-term financial oriented. And Steve struggled. He was brilliant in the quality areas, but he really wasn't as good at the cost and the quantity and the cycle time to a level that his stakeholders in Wall Street really wanted. And that caused his board to not support him and really force him out, essentially, in the middle of his career. And this was very, very difficult for Steve. You know, the company he founded basically rejected him. And then he went on, of course, to start Pixar and Next being another computer company that sort of finished the work he tried to do at Apple. Pixar, the movie house that produced the world's first completely computer-generated movie, and eventually came back to Apple at the request of Apple's then CEO, Gil Amelio, to really transform Apple into more insanely great products like the iPod, like the iPhone. He became much more mature. He was able to bounce back and learn from some of the mistakes he'd made as a younger leader and really grow Apple far beyond its humble origins. So I want to talk now about 5 takeaways you can learn from Steve Jobs, and I'm hoping you're taking a couple notes now to say what you might want to do differently as a result of listening to this webinar. The first one is around Steve's relentless learning. Early on, he studied at Reed College. He dropped out, but he didn't stop learning. Even though he wasn't actually a student at Reed College, he slept on his friends' couches. He studied art and calligraphy, which later came to influence the Macintosh's fonts. He went to India and learned much about Eastern ways of thinking. He constantly would bring in new talent from whom he could learn, like Jay Elliott, who wrote The Steve Jobs Way and I Lead, a great book that I can recommend, around ways to scale a larger organization, particularly human resource type matters. And famously, he quoted a book in one of his Stanford graduation speeches saying, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." He never stopped learning. He constantly was relentlessly passionate about the next great technology and really making a difference in the world. So for all of us, his role modeling around constantly learning, admitting our mistakes. He was embarrassed about the way he treated his first daughter. He was embarrassed about the way he treated some of his employees and wished he hadn't been so brutal on them at the end of his life. So he never stopped learning, and that's something we can all learn from him. Secondly, he was unbelievably resilient. If you think about different leaders and their ability to be resilient, certainly Steve Jobs never faced life and death kinds of leadership situations like Gandhi, but very few leaders start multiple firms from scratch and come back to their original startup and transform it beyond its humble origins the way Steve did. He's truly one of the world's greats. And so for us to see setbacks and maybe even extremely disappointing moments in our careers as opportunities to learn is another remarkable aspect of Steve Jobs that is not like most other leaders living today or in history. Third, in my new book, Leading Value Creation, I talk about how Steve and lots of other leaders are also great followers. They don't just lead all by themselves, and they want great people around them that are better than themselves so that they can follow them. Steve Jobs followed Steve Wozniak in technical matters at the beginning of Apple. Steve would bring in great people like John Scully, who he thought was going to be better than him at running a company so he could get down in the stuff he loved around new product development. Later, he called Johnny Ives his spiritual partner around design. And so if you think about the way Jobs and other leaders design boards, they want people with skills to help them cope with the volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous, or VUCA situation they all face. They want people with financial and legal and market savvy that are better than themselves so that they can really make a dent in the universe. In fact, at the end of his career, Steve was quite passionate that what was more important to him than the products that he created, which he was proud of, was the fact that he had a sustainable organization that would carry on his legacy beyond his lifetime. And that should be something that all leaders should want to emulate. So this idea of oscillating between leading and following, depending on who has the better idea, Steve was a brilliant role model of this. Now, obviously, Steve had brilliant ideas all the time. People wanted to follow him. But he also wanted to follow them if they could do something he couldn't, if they needed to be part of the team. He would proactively go out of his way, including when he got deposed from the Lisa project onto the Macintosh project. He went throughout Apple to recruit people he wanted to follow who were better than himself at some of the technical aspects of the Macintosh. The fourth takeaway is relentlessly challenging yourself. He was the first, with Wozniak, to create the personal computer industry. He was the first to commercialize the mouse, even though Xerox Palo Alto Park invented the mouse. It was a piece of wood and it wasn't commercially viable. He was the first to redesign it to be actually commercially viable. He famously named the first commercially viable GUI after his first daughter, being embarrassed about how he wasn't supportive of her in the beginning of her life. He pioneered digital publishing, as well as I mentioned already, the first completely digital movie in the history of the world. I was at Motorola when I was responsible for Six Sigma when Apple and Steve were using iTunes for the very, very first time on Motorola devices. And of course, Motorola didn't even remotely do as well as Apple with the iPhone, which Jobs famously pioneered to a level that's really far beyond the cell phone's humble origins. So Steve's relentless challenging of himself and his team was another thing that drove him to greatness. So we all can constantly beat our personal best. It's something like Olympic gold medalists who already hold the gold record, or the gold medal, or the world record. They don't stop. They relentlessly, constantly challenge themselves, and Steve was a wonderful role model of this. Fifth and last takeaway is that Steve had a very good support system. Many of you know about Woz, but did you know that he also learned a great deal from Nolan Bushnell, who was the founder and CEO of Atari, where he worked early in his career. Similarly, the first investor in Apple Computers, Mike Markkula, mentored him and was at Apple for more than 20 years in a very senior leadership role, and gave him great advice that he appreciated. I mentioned Joni Ive, who he called his spiritual partner in design. Jay Elliott, I also mentioned around, Jay was quite a bit older than Steve. They met in a chance meeting at a restaurant, and Jay Elliott was a former IBM guy, and Steve would often go to Jay for advice on how to be a better manager. Ann Bowers was the Intel founder, Bob Noyce's spouse. She was also his head of HR quite a few times, and would constantly call him at his request on his bad behaviors, where he would berate and swear at and embarrass some of his followers. And so she played an important role at trying to help him self-regulate, which perhaps helped a little bit, but perhaps not as much as Steve at the end of his life would have liked. And for all of us, this means we should be looking around us for people that can give us good advice, give us good feedback, who can be our mentors, who can give us coaching. Notice that Jobs didn't really have formal training as a leader. He didn't take classes. He did read lots of books, though. He brought lots of his own self-learning and learning from others into his leadership style that made him the leader that he was at the end of his life. Now, I've been fascinated with leaders like Steve for a long time, and Steve, of course, isn't the only famous leader from whom we can learn. When I was working with the founders of Infosys for the last 4.5 years, they really inspired me, and I think the world would be a much better place if we had more Steve Jobs and Nelson Mandelas and Narendra Murthy's. And so I invented a technology that allows you to measure yourself and then compare yourself to leaders like Steve Jobs in a more detailed way than I'm able to do in this short webinar. This uses the latest science that's just like a thermometer, so that you can look at what you're good at already, what's too easy for you, what's too hard, and just personalize a subset of actions you can do that either mimic what famous leaders did to grow, or what the new science tells us improve your odds. So just like Steve Jobs was relentless, he didn't have this technology, but I would hope he would be pleased to see that on an iPhone you could assess yourself, get feedback from others just like he did all the time in his career, and then get a personalized game plan with pushed e-coaching or recommendations and a community of support where webinars like this one, where others can give you support around relentless development, just like Steve was relentless in his own development of his leadership. So I hope what I've done so far in the conversation is give you a snapshot of some aspects of Steve Jobs' leadership that was really extremely remarkable, perhaps the best in the history of leadership, and also some extremely embarrassing and awful things that Steve Jobs did that even he was not happy with at the end of his life, so that we can take away these 5 lessons to improve our own leadership. The technology that I'm proposing is just one way. You don't necessarily need my technology, but the technology is designed to help you make these lessons embedded in your daily life. It's easy. Even Steve Jobs needed help once in a while from his wife or from any of his coaches and mentors and friends to get back on track when he would go awry. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to you, Ali, for questions from the audience.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Barney. Folks, we're open for Q&A. If you have a question, you could raise your hand, There's a hand icon available on your webinar console. So if you click on it, I'll give you a chance to speak to Dr. Barney, or you could put your questions in the question box. Let me see. I see there's a couple of questions. Okay, there's one question, Doctor, interesting, that considering that in early days Steve was developing stealing applications, has ever the ethical bar in his life became an obstacle at a later stage, especially when he was passionate about remaining number one? And
Definitely. Even Wozniak complained about this with Jobs. Woz was raised that engineering was extremely great and that management wasn't so great and that you had to be absolutely truthful at all costs, and it hurt Wozniak. It hurt Steve Jobs' relationships with his own co-founder, the fact that he wasn't truthful about the very first game they both worked on together at Apple. Steve was to get $5,000 worth of bonus if he could get the game done in 4 days, and he never told Woz this. In fact, it was corroborated in Walter Isaacson's biography, his authorized biography by Jobs, that Jobs lied about this. And so not just famous co-founders of Apple, but lots of other people at Apple didn't trust Steve as much as they should have. So we should learn from Steve in not being dishonest, not stealing, because people aren't going to want to work with us as much in the future. Now, he was able to come around, and he also lied about being the father of Lisa, and which he came later to regret. So he had hurt people, and he really regretted this. And if we don't want to regret our own careers, and we don't want to damage our relationships, we should not mimic some of the mistakes he made, like not being truthful at times. I hope that answers the question.
Let me move. Okay, there was another comment that somebody tried to access leaderamp.com, but it said it wasn't responsive. Maybe you can try later. Let me move to another question. There was okay, why most successful business leaders not equally reflect the same to manage their families? Is it because of lack of controls they can practice at home, or because of lack of emotional intellect?
I think it's a good question. I think many of them, like Steve, are very driven. They're very, very passionate about their organizations, and sometimes they have failings. I think Steve Jobs is what we would call in psychology a bit narcissistic. And I think there are other leaders that similarly only think of themselves and their ambition at the expense of other things in their life that they come to regret later. At the same time, it is very, very difficult to achieve greatness. It is difficult to start a new company from scratch. And so I do think I agree with the intent of the question that we should really understand how we can achieve multiple goals in our lives, not just the business goals, because we may want to lead our families, and we can't neglect our children and our spouses and only deal with our corporate world. I think Jobs clearly regretted this, and at the very, very end of his life, he spent almost all his time with his family. And so we should lead thinking about the end of our lives and what we want our legacy to be. If you were to ask Jobs, I think he would tell you he would much prefer to have spent more time on those family relationships than he did. So I think this is another reason we need supports in our growth as leaders. We need people to put a mirror up in front of us. My technology is just one way you can do it. You can ask friends and loved ones to put mirrors in front of us and make sure we're not damaging our families, make sure we're going to achieve all the things we want to and have no regrets at the end of our lives.
Let me move to another question. If you were to rank the top 5 leaders in the world, whom would be, what would be your choice and why?
Well, I hope to actually measure that with my new app. I'm going to start out only with historical leaders. The app's still under development. It's not ready yet. and we will announce a crowdfunding campaign to actually answer your question directly. But if I just had to pick one of my very, very favorites alive right now is Elon Musk. Elon is an amazing entrepreneurial leader who, like Jobs, is very, very driven. Like Jobs, has damaged some of his family relationships. He's been divorced a couple of times, but he founded a company that acquired PayPal, made billions. He is now CEO of Tesla, SpaceX, and chairman of a solar company. And so his visionary leadership around what Consumer Reports rates as the best car ever made, the Tesla Model S, and SpaceX, which is a fraction of the cost of other ways of shooting things into space, is really, really remarkable. And how he can keep two CEO jobs and the chairman of Solar City, his solar company, is really, really remarkable. I think he does a good job of being more humble. I think he's, like Jobs, I think he's very, very difficult to work with, but part of that is because these things, these world firsts, are very difficult to achieve. When I worked with Madinah, the founder of Infosys, he told me he viewed other entrepreneurial leaders, and he'd heard about some that came before him, as being very, very difficult, like Hewlett-Packard, or he mentioned Ratan Tata, J.R.D. Tata, the founder of the Tata Group in India, as being very difficult people, but perhaps that's required in some ways to insist on things people have never seen before. And so I respect Elon Musk because he's got this visionary leadership, something like Jobs, across multiple industries. But, you know, I really like Madinah. He would be a number 1 or 2 for me as well. He is a very humble, self-effacing billionaire. He's a very human guy. He is not like Jobs or Elon Musk in that I have much more respect for Murthy in his family orientation. He's as good to the person who cleans the Infosys toilets as he is to the chairman of the, well, he is the chairman, but to the other people on the board. And so I think different leaders I have different respect for different things. So those are just 2 of my 5, but I would say stay tuned. I would much prefer to measure these folks with my new technology than just give you an off-the-cuff remark.
Dr. Barney, a lot of people are asking about the link of the website where they can perhaps download the app.
So the app, I'm glad you asked. So the app, it's still under development. They can sign up just on my regular website, leaderamp.com. They can, or send me an email at my email address there, matt@leaderamp.com. I can let you know. We're going to announce a crowdfunding pre-order campaign where people can be among the first to join the community to use the app and get access to the different resources like e-coaching that it'll have available. But it doesn't exist yet. That's why they can't download it yet. We just have the mock-up, and it's under development as we speak.
Okay, all right. Well, there's another one from Brother Mustafa Ahmed. Can the leadership style of Jobs be stimulated in a non-innovation routine functions?
Yes, we know from science that his charisma, a friend of mine, Professor John Antonakis at the Université de Lausanne in Switzerland, has shown that you can teach Steve Jobs-style charisma. And the way we do that is from using metaphors, 3-part lists, making sure people hear the emotion and see us very committed to the ordinary operations that we have and why it's so important, translating that passion and that importance of those operations into reality for followers. So, for example, when I was in healthcare, you know, in the emergency room, for example, there's not a lot of innovation going on there, but it's extremely important to keep people alive by triaging, diagnosing patients, making sure that you're dealing with their airways and bleeding before you do other things to keep them up and, you know, saving their lives. And so the moral purpose is very, very clear, and the leader's job is to make sure people know why their ordinary operations are so important. I also think Steve Jobs-style instrumental leadership, in my new book, I talk about my QC model, which says, you know, Jobs is great at quality. He wasn't always as good at cost. In fact, that kind of lost him his job. He was decent at scalability and not so great at cycle time or schedules. He constantly slipped his schedule. But in even ordinary operations, we have quality, cost, quantity, or cycle time. These are the QC aspects to my model that if we holistically look at all of them and help the whole team, as Steve Jobs did, see why the future is important, how that team's work contributes to the overall organization, then we can mimic Steve in that area. And of course, even within our operations, there are opportunities to innovate. And pointing the team's attention on the things that matter most is something that both Steve Jobs was good at, and if you have your whole team look at the quality, cost, quantity, cycle time for innovation opportunities, then even ordinary operations, you can use Steve Jobs style innovation, pointing the team in the right places that matter the most.
Thank you. Let us move to a caller who has raised a hand. We have Dr. Muhammad Rashad. Dr. Muhammad, can you hear us? Hello, Dr. Muhammad? Dr. Muhammad, you raised your hand. Just unmuted you. Could you speak up? I believe Dr. has gone. He's our regular caller also. Okay, there's another interesting question. You mentioned that one needs a coach and a mentor to work with you. Should you as a leader take a decision yourself to hire a personal coach, or rather take a professional advice to hire one?
That's a great question. Well, first, let me just say it doesn't just have to be a coach that you pay. You know, Jobs got mentoring from just friends and bosses and people that cared about him. And then later, even of subordinates, like Bob Noyce's wife, the founder of Intel's wife, who became Jobs' head of HR. So it's not just about hiring a coach. You can get mentors around you. Now, what's useful about a coach is that they may be able to give you a third-party objective point of view that maybe your other colleagues don't have the professional expertise to give you about your behavior or about your business, or maybe they just don't have the time. So I think Steve Jobs' lessons and the science would say you don't want to just learn from one group. You want a variety. I feel strongly that you had another mild presenter, John Reed, who made a recommendation that they should have behavioral science expertise as well as business expertise, and I agree with him. I think regardless of whether it's a friend of yours recommending someone or someone that an expert recommends to you, do they actually know about the science of human behavior? Do they actually know about organizations and business? And can they combine that expertise in a way that translates to your specific personal needs? And those needs could be growing your strengths, or the needs could be addressing your weaknesses, or both. But I think the key is, do they actually have credible expertise in these areas, and not to get it from just one source? Because even if you hire a coach, you're still going to want good feedback from your colleagues, from your mentors, from other people who care about you and want to advance your career.
Sir, we have Dr. Muhammad requested once again if we can unmute him just to see if he is able to speak up, because he is able to hear us, but unfortunately we couldn't hear him last time. Dr. Muhammad, I unmuted you again. Can you hear us? Dr. Muhammad, unfortunately I have to mute you again. I believe you have an audio issue at your end. But Dr. Barney, that really brings us towards the end of the webinar. So any concluding remarks that you would like to give?
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity. I think the key thing I want you to leave with is that Steve Jobs relentlessly grew. He was not perfect. He had all kinds of ways he would gauge himself, practice and stretch himself, and get support. So that measurement, challenge, and support is something that you should all be doing on a regular basis. And I appreciate your time today. Thank you for having me.
Very much, and equally it was wonderful to have you on this live webinar. And thank you for sharing a very, very interesting presentation. And folks, all of you who participated, thank you very much, and for posting your questions. We are recording this webinar, which will be uploaded on Mile Community, which is community.mile.org. And very nicely, an illustration of thank you, shukran, in different languages from Dr. Barney, very nicely laid out. And
Thank you.
well, with that note, I would like to end the webinar.